hope everybody has my cell phone if they have any specific questions. If not, feel free just to come grab me and we can engage throughout the weekend. But I want to make sure that I'm not running too far over. So I want to introduce Ryan Fischer.
Thank you so much.
Spill the coffee.
Yeah, don't spill it on me. It'd be a horrible way to start. Thank you so much. A round of applause for Jeff and his team, who are incredible. I had the opportunity to attend the Science Symposium, and I'm so impressed in what your community is building. As Jeff mentioned, I've spent 2 decades in patient advocacy, first with the Duchenne community for 18 years, and then met Allison Barron with Angelman syndrome, and have been with Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics ever since. I hope to impart on you in those 2 decades of advocacy some lessons learned, not just theory, of how patient advocacy and advocacy at the federal and state level can really move the needle. But I first want to acknowledge that every person in this room is already an advocate. The first time you sought answers for your child, the first time you trusted your instincts, and went to doctor's appointments to get those answers, that was advocacy. And it's something you've been doing in a job you didn't necessarily ask for and were thrust into. But every doctor appointment, every meeting with the school, every argument with insurers, every conversation with friends and family talking about Kleefstra, every comment from a stranger, which is usually idiotic, that you've held back from hitting, that was restraint, but it's also advocacy. So this is a muscle you've built over time. And that same muscle can be used to advance research, drug development, policy, legislation. You have those tools already. They're inherent. And that's what patient-focused drug development is all about. It's making sure decision makers are informed about your lived experience so they can make better decisions on behalf of all your families. You know, treatments don't succeed because of one breakthrough. They succeed because communities build the environment where breakthroughs can become therapies, and really turning the hope he has and passion into influence. And IDefine, Jeff and his team have been helping to build that environment with your help. You'll hear a lot about these building blocks that they've been putting together to enable a space to bring therapies forward. But they're critical, and sometimes they're, you know, they're not sexy. They're things that have to be done to really properly bring forward a path for treatments. And just to sort of go through some of them, and I have my laptop here so I can actually see what I'm looking at. The disease understanding. This is about characterizing, understanding the genetics, establishing standard of care, you know, making sure we know everything we can about the natural history. Many of you have participated in those studies. This is foundational to move forward towards developing treatments. Is it working? Okay, good. It's hard to see with the monitor there, just bear with me. And then the science, of course, the disease mechanisms, therapeutic targets, cell models, all these things you'll be hearing about. Some of you have been, you know, engaged in, but these are critical building blocks that you have to put forward. Clinical infrastructure, you'll be hearing from clinicians about having these experts in Kleefstra syndrome who know the disease, establishing care centers, participating in patient registries, research networks, and being ready for trials as well. And then you all, you are critical to this process. Connecting with each other, educating each other, mentoring each other. these conferences, forming a global network, all of it so important. Patient experience. And we'll talk a little bit about this and what this means, because this is now an official term at the FDA, patient experience data. But it involves things like patient-reported outcomes, caregiver-reported outcomes in our case, patient preference studies, how you feel about emerging treatments, what sort of benefits are your priority, and what sorts of risks are you willing to take on. And then the voice of this community, telling your stories. Jeff was talking about stories. Those stories matter. It gives context to those who don't know anything about Kleefstra so they can make a better decision on your behalf. Engaging regulatory and industry, and we'll talk a bit about that. And then sustained funding for really the whole model. What I've learned over time is that we are at the mercy, unfortunately, of a much larger drug development ecosystem, like it or not. And that ecosystem involves human components, so people that make decisions, researchers, doctors, pharma, regulators, payers, Congress, and the agencies that fund that's funded by Congress. These are all humans who may not know anything about your lived experience, but are making decisions and are empowered to make decisions that affect your lives. So I don't know about you, but I want them to know as much as possible about what matters to you so that they can make a much more informed decision. And they are sort of intertwined with the non-living components of funding cycles. Am I tracking here? Funding cycles, policy and legislation, and markets, unfortunately. So, all of these things can impact what's happening in your drug development space. And what I've always looked at is how can we influence these elements. Some of them might be out of our control, but constantly looking at, where are the leverage points, where can we possibly make change. So today I'm going to mostly focus on regulators, Congress, not much on payers, but the things we do on the front end can affect the payer environment. And the strategy needs to be a both and. So we need a advocacy strategy that focuses on Kleefstra, of course, but then there is a rare disease broad component, because rare diseases are all affected by many of the similar barriers to drug development in terms of population size, small trials, heterogeneous communities where, this is our first at bat of trying to develop a treatment for our loved ones. So there is efforts through policy and legislation that bring the rare disease community together, and we work together to affect change because we're all impacted by these things. All right, let's start with FDA. So I think many are aware, FDA, their mission, protect the public from unsafe events, food, medications, promote the public health, and then they have to follow rules and regulations that Congress sets out. And this is sort of where we come in, and we have the ability to influence how they do their work by working with Congress and telling them FDA should be doing X, Y, and Z when it comes to rare disease. Okay. So FDA has a rather interesting history. They were formed in 1906, and many times FDA has changed over time because of public health crises, major events, and what we call tipping points. The first was around food safety. There was unsafe practices at meat packing plants in Chicago. It was highlighted in a novel by Upton Sinclair. It brought about the formation of the agency. and gave them regulatory power to make sure foods were safe. Their powers expanded in 1938, where there was an elixir that caused, unfortunately, 100 deaths. And Congress gave FDA more power over safety when it comes to regulating medications. Oh, I'm not tracking as well here, am I? And then in 1962, there was a safety and efficacy tipping point that happened because of a drug called thalidomide, which was morning sickness medication causing birth defects in babies. It just so happened that the FDA in the US did not approve this, but in Europe, they did approve it. So the birth defects were happening in Europe. Congress said, well, FDA got this right. Let's enshrine more powers on both safety and efficacy when it comes to drugs. And these were called Kefauver amendments. Orphan Drug Act, I just want to highlight, this was huge for incentivizing companies to come into the rare disease space. They were given, tax breaks and a whole slew of ways to bring these things forward. I know it comes down to money, which can be frustrating, but this changed the game, so I wanted to throw that into the timeline. And then so much changed with the HIV/AIDS crisis. At the time, the FDA was woefully understaffed. So what happened was Congress and industry came up with a plan to provide more funding to the agency, to get more regulators, because the review of applications were taking too long. And this is called PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. Congress gives 50%, they get 50% of the budget from your tax dollars. The other 50% comes from industry, companies, where they pay millions of dollars to get their applications reviewed by FDA. It provided funding for the agency to have way more people to speed the development of these therapies going through the process. And this was landmark legislation to speed that development, and it exists today. It has to pass every 5 years. Because 50% come from Congress and taxpayer dollars, we get an opportunity to come in and say FDA should be doing things differently and influence the process. The next PDUFA is actually coming up next year. It's going to be an opportunity. But this was a major, major tipping point for how the FDA does business. And then subsequent PDUFAs following included things like increasing interactions between sponsors and the FDA, more meetings to ensure that these drugs can get through more efficiently. And then 2002 was right after 9/11. There was elements of post-market and bioterrorism. But then a huge tipping point happened with the patient voice involvement in drug development. And this came about in 2012. I was humbled and lucky enough to work on this legislation. This was PDUFA 5, and it was called the FDA Safety and Innovation Act. And essentially what Congress did, because they heard from us loud and clear, was we were concerned the FDA was not incorporating the views of families into their decision-making. So Congress mandated that the FDA take a structured and transparent approach into incorporating your views into how they make decisions about drugs that you are taking, which sounds crazy that we had to legislate it, but we did. And what the FDA did in response was they launched the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative. And this initiative brought about a whole new structure and framework. It brought about opportunities to engage the agency directly about our conditions, about your lived experience, and also mandated that the FDA tell us how are they even making those decisions around benefit and risk, which is they ultimately need to show why drugs are safe and effective, and they perform what's called a benefit risk assessment. And it created this new table. So this is a public-facing table that the FDA has to now fill out because of that legislation that we wrote into legislation, where they tell us how they looked at the analysis of the condition, the current treatment, the benefit of the drug in front of them, the risks and the risk management. So again, more transparency into, well, how did you weigh these things when you decided whether or not to actually approve? And PDUFA 5 opened the door for so many of us. We took advantage of this. There was, and I'll go over this in a bit, more opportunities to engage the FDA directly, right? They weren't meeting with patient groups. And there was so much happening in rare disease drug development. It was expanding, it was evolving, and think about all the reviewers. There are 7,000 plus rare diseases. We can't expect them to know everything, but why weren't they engaging families directly, right? You live this, you know this. So communities, and part of PPMD started to really ramp up how we were going to decide to provide the agency with such information. At the time, we called it PFDD data, but anything about the patient experience. And we published on a lot of this work. So it sort of innovated this space of how do we get data and engagement to the FDA about our communities. So at PPMD, we were still frustrated because we were noticing that we were sending FDA information about our community. We were publishing on it. We were doing white papers, doing surveys, but we didn't have any transparency into whether or not they did anything with the data, right? We're asking you to take surveys all the time. What happens with that data? Who looks at it? Do they care about it? So a really remarkable opportunity presented itself, and this doesn't happen all the time, but thanks to champions on the Hill, specifically Fred Upton and Diana DeGette, they proposed a bill outside of the PDUFA cycle of those every 5-year cycles, and that was called 21st Century Cures. And we presented, oh, whoops, sorry, wrong button. So at PPMD, we decided to work on our own legislation. We called it the Patient Focused Impact Assessment Act. Pat, my old boss, testified to that. Pretty simple. We said, FDA, fill out a checklist. Tell us if you had access to all this data that deals with the patient experience. We're sending it to you. We need a feedback loop. We need to understand reviewers are going to look at it before they make a decision that can affect the lives of thousands of people. It passed the Senate, and then, lucky enough, it landed in this larger vehicle, which is how these things actually happen, into the 21st Century Cures Act. There were a lot of really great initiatives in that act, including the pediatric voucher, which is an incentive for companies to develop drugs in rare. It gave more funding to NIH and FDA, and importantly, it was included in the final draft of that legislation. And this is what it looks like. This is what the FDA, I know it might be hard to read, but I'm going to go over this in a second. This is what the FDA has to fill out now at the end of the process. Did they have access to all these types of, and I can send these slides, by the way, all these types of information, everything from clinical outcome assessments to qualitative studies, so interviews with families, if there was a PFDD meeting, which we'll talk about in a bit, natural history, patient preference studies, et cetera. And importantly, the legislation, which I was grateful to help define patient experience data and what does it actually mean. And I'll go over that in a second too. They also put out guidances, which was another part of the legislation we proposed. We said, you want us to collect this information, but how do we collect it? So give us guidance on exactly what to do, what methods to use to provide you with such critical information that hopefully will inform your decisions. So FDA did set out to do those guidances, and those guidances are now on FDA's website. Okay. So just to break this table down, which is hard to read probably, patient experience data is a broad term. It covers everything, and I'll go over that definition in just a bit. But when you look at this chart, it can include clinical outcome assessments, patient-reported outcomes, clinician-reported, caregiver-reported outcomes. That's there. Qualitative studies, data specific to patients in the trial or outside the trial. You know, those stories Jeff was talking about, that's qualitative data, that's context, right? Focus groups, interviews, all these things. Data from PFDD meetings. I'll talk about what a PFDD meeting is in a bit, but there's a summary report that goes with that. Observational studies and natural history studies. For all those participating in those, thank you. They make a huge difference. It can include data from patient registries as well. And then data from patient preference studies. These are studies that can be done specific to the drug or outside for the general population. FDA needs to understand what your benefit-risk trade-offs are, right? What's the minimal benefit for what sort of risks and trial burdens would you be willing to take on? Because ultimately that's how they make a decision, and it's so important for them to know this and hear from you. And then any patient experience data submitted outside a data package. And what I recommend for many community is to conduct your own annual audit around patient experience data. What exists? What's missing? Where can you fill in gaps? I know everyone's tired of taking surveys, but if IDefine asks you to take a survey, there should be a reason behind it, and there should be a goal for what they want to do with the data. So this is something I always recommend that patient groups do. Okay, just to look at the definition of patient experience data. So it's defined as, it can be interpreted as information that captures experiences, perspectives, needs, priorities related to, but not limited to, symptoms of the condition and natural history, impact of that condition on function and quality of life, experience with current standard of care, input of what outcomes are most important to you all, the preferences for treatments that I just talked about, and then the relative importance of any of those issues. You know, you might prioritize one outcome over the other. They need to understand this so that they can make a more informed decision. So this is another thing you can look at and say, are we providing this context clearly to decision makers? And that includes industry who are going to be developing treatments. You are on the road for that. The things you're doing is incredible. You're building that foundation. But I always think that we have to sort of take this in our own hands, because we also will make it shareable to anyone. You know, companies may do these surveys too, but it's proprietary and they might want to keep it for themselves. But what we did at PPMD is we would do this, share it, publish it, send it to anyone who wanted to utilize it. So the other thing the legislation did was it brought about avenues for engaging FDA. But it's important to know, like, how does FDA actually make decisions? They perform what's called a benefit risk assessment, okay? And that assessment involves several domains. They need to understand the impact. You see Angelman syndrome here. That's, I use that as the sort of anchor here. Perspective on available treatments, the natural history. What is a meaningful benefit, you know, in a new treatment? And what would be most meaningful to you and your families? The trade-offs that you would accept, and then the overall disease understanding from a scientific and clinical basis. So this is all the factors they're weighing when they're making that assessment, okay? And again, do they have clarity in all these areas? That's what we have to always ask ourselves. Are we providing this type of information, or is it too vague and they are going to have to make a judgment call, because they will in the end. Okay, so one of the mechanisms that FDA put out after PDUFA 5 was called listening sessions. These are short meetings with FDA staff It could be broad or a narrow focus. For instance, my community went in about our current outcome measures, that they weren't sufficient enough. Daily, we were using a whole slew of condition-specific measures that didn't fit our community. And what actually happened was we came out of that meeting with a new development of an outcome measure called the ORCA. And now that's being used in numerous conditions across the NDDs. Okay. Externally led PFDD meetings. So this is another avenue for engagement with the FDA. What happened here was the FDA couldn't take on all these meetings, so patient groups started doing them themselves. We submit letters of intent. They are held by the patient group, is invited, and then a report is generated called the Voice of the Patient Report that lives on the FDA's website. And so any regulator who's going to see a new application that comes in about your condition will have that report to refer to. And it's all about your lived experience, what matters most to you in new treatments, benefit risk. So it's a great way to ensure that, you know, these regulators who come across hundreds and hundreds of diseases have a reference point. So this is exactly what we did as a community. We submitted a letter of intent. We held our meeting on April 7th. It was a successful meeting. It was done virtually. You can do them in person or virtually. In the end, we had 227 caregivers, 41 FDA staff, 67 drug developers, and 27 healthcare professionals and researchers. And you can find the details on angelmanadvocates.org. And the sort of purpose of the meeting was spotlight what matters most to our community and improve their understanding of the challenges of living with Angelman syndrome, every aspect of the condition. It's 24/7. You all understand that. And ultimately to inform drug development and regulatory review. So it was a big milestone for the community and now lives on the FDA website. And here's just a look at the report. You know, the main sort of tenements of the report included comprehensive lived experience, that the pervasive daily impact is really hard for families. It's around the clock. And that the current standard of care is limited. It's not enough. We need more. And that's an important message. And the other important message we stressed was that even modest improvements, this is something they need to understand. We're not looking for blockbusters to start. Even improving one specific symptom could be life-changing for our families, right? Many regulators might not understand that, but they need to. You can do that through these meetings. I think the timing of the meeting matters, though, okay? I've often had folks come to me and say, should we do our meeting? We know that this is a possibility. I believe that they are most powerful probably once trials are starting to get underway and FDA is going to be looking at applications. That's my take on it. I think some may have, you know, differing opinions. I think a listening session, as I mentioned before, could be really helpful as you're trying to choose a primary endpoint for trials. What are we going to measure and what will be the specific instrument that's used? But I'm happy to talk more with Jeff and others about my take on these meetings in the future, which you'll all be a part of. Because what we have to understand at the end of the day, the value of a treatment and what you value in even first-generation treatments can differ strongly between a payer, a physician, a drug company, and a regulator. So At the end of the day, it's a value judgment that the FDA is placing, right? So we need to give more information to those decision makers about what you value. And you can do that by bridging this gap, essentially between the science and the patient experience. And that's really done through a whole host of efforts of understanding disease burden, unmet need, outcome measures and endpoints, preferences, quality of life measures, symptom priorities, and your preferences for treatment. So this is something, a lot of it's social science, and it's something that I've spent my career doing, but you can quantify how people think and feel about emerging therapies, and there's methods to do so. And you put it in the literature. That's what's important. Publish. This information should be out there, because that's what decision makers are pulling from, right? They want to see something in publication, peer-reviewed. But these are important steps, and this can't be done without you. You have to be at the center of this. Okay, switching gears to Congress. This is something I've spent my career doing. I actually came from the Hill prior to coming into patient advocacy, and I been bringing advocates to the Hill for over 20 years. It's getting harder and harder to convince people to come to Washington and deal with Congress, but it is so important, because this is another layer of decision-making that happens, and advocacy has been one of the key things that have changed the way Congress acts, and then subsequently how Congress acts with the federal agencies, because they fund the federal agencies. They have the power of the purse, of course. So this is why Congress. So your voices, your stories, making connections, especially in person. Nothing replaces in-person advocacy. It's why I've been doing Hill Days for so many years. Congress is a reactive body, right? They're driven by your demands. They have to set the priorities. And the hope is that what we do on the Hill will turn into action and support for our communities on rare disease legislation like 21st Century Cures, which really impacted us. We've had losses too. The Medicaid debate that happened, we had advocates on the Hill before that bill, which I won't call the big beautiful bill, because for our community it wasn't so. But you know, it was not an easy year, and so we do suffer some losses, but we get a lot of gains out of telling our story, having Congress understand your lived experience. Because honestly, empathy is one of the things that has changed the world. When someone understands your experiences, many of them do take action to create change. Here's just a look at some of the federal agencies that touch our communities. FDA, of course, CMS, CDC, Social Security, NIH, and a really unique program out of the Department of Defense called the Congressional Directed Medical Research Program, which I won't go into now, but I can in the future if you want to connect. But these are targets for us, and the way you target them is direct engagement, but also through Congress, who fund those agencies. So when we go to the Hill, we think about, okay, what are we doing that can affect these specific federal agencies? As I mentioned, their key power allocating and spending your tax dollars, set the funding priorities and direction for all the federal agencies. And we want to influence that, and we can. It's why one of the reasons we, in our community, go to the Hill, because we want to understand what are they doing in terms of funding for Angelman syndrome, and do they understand what the needs and priorities are of our community, because they, in fact, work for us, and Congress is a big seating chart, which changes. Advocacy is a constant. It does not. And that's why you have to be persistent and consistent, and we go every year for that reason. They also pass major legislation, as I was saying before, PDUFA, Orphan Drug Act, 21st Century Cures. We want to ensure that that legislation that could have the potential to impact us, drug development, regulation, and again, speaking through our members of Congress. I work very closely with the Every Life Foundation. Many of you, I'm not sure if you're aware of them. They're an umbrella group who are on the Hill, just focused on rare disease policy and legislation. That's all they do. And I trust them to do that broader work. But when we go to the Hill, we'll talk about Angelman syndrome, our priorities, but we'll also look at the rare disease broader legislation and say, this matters to us too, and we rely on them to do so. The tough part is, of course, Congress is so divided. And what I stress, and I think what the beautiful thing about advocacy in rare disease, it's nonpartisan. We have champions on both sides of the aisle. When I take a group of advocates to the Hill, I say, leave your party affiliation at the door. Because what's interesting about being part of a rare disease community, it's kind of this weird social experiment where you're connected by the diagnosis, but you're interacting with people on different parts of the party line, right? You may disagree wholeheartedly on politics, and we all see it on Facebook, which gets entertaining to say the least, but you are connected and you want to do things together. And my advice is just to leave that stuff at the door. So we don't go in with a party affiliation. We are affiliated with our own communities, and it's so important. And it's kind of lovely because you can not talk politics for that couple of days we're on the Hill. So we've gone 3 times in Angelman syndrome for our annual fly-in. I'm lucky enough to work with the other organization in our space, the Angelman Syndrome Foundation. I came from the Duchenne community, not to air dirty laundry, but there was a lot of factions in that community. They did not. Many foundations. So when I came to Angelman syndrome, I didn't come with any baggage. There was real tension between the two groups, and advocacy was the natural equalizer. I said, let's do this together. And it's been very successful to date. We've gotten all of our priorities through, and we are just going to continue to go to Washington. And we've told them that. You'll see us next year. We'll be back. We'll always be back. And I think it's just so important when it comes to how we can influence things. So the next PDUFA is coming up. I've been part of the negotiations so far. Some of this is wonky. I won't go into every detail. We're looking to expand patient-focused drug development. It's a couple of programs that have been really helpful for developing therapies that are set to be part of the next bill. There's reduced fees for those who want to do phase 1 in the U.S., and these RISE workshops. So the Rare Disease Innovation Hub was born out of the FDA through advocacy from the rare disease community. We wanted a specific area of FDA that only focused on rare disease and could connect those who may not have experience in how you regulate rare disease at the agency to have a reference point. So there's now an office and a hub, and they do a series of workshops, and they train internally at FDA. So again, this was because advocacy went to the Hill and said, this isn't good enough. You all need to learn how you can use your flexibility when it comes to rare and sort of the barriers we face, et cetera. This is must-pass legislation. So next year, you're going to be hearing about provisions or pieces of legislation that could help rare disease, and we're going to be advocating. We're going to be sending action alerts, and we're going to go to the Hill. And we're going to say, here's how you can make the next PDUFA better. So I just want to leave you with some final thoughts. You know, when people think about advocacy, I think they think about someone with a bullhorn or testifying before Congress or the FDA, but advocacy rarely begins there. It begins with families who are willing to share their experiences honestly. Every survey, every registry you participate, natural history, really those building blocks that shape drug development, you know, all of that is part of advocacy. And you're doing it here. It's been so impressive to see the work. I know it's never fast enough, but you're on the right track. I am thoroughly impressed what this community is doing. My advice is to keep going. You know, communities that make the greatest progress are not always the largest. It's the ones that work together on a shared strategy, right? And work together to create change. Science develops treatments, but organized, informed, persistent communities create the environment that allows for such change. And the success you see from all those groups that are up there happened because they refused to believe their voices don't matter. And they used their voices to advance their cause and make change at the federal and state level. So if anything, I hope I can leave you with that your voice truly matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Does anybody have any questions? We don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to open it up. Yes. Hold on one second, Eric. I'm going to bring it to you. Just so everybody online can hear.
Don't give me a mic. Just a question about the kind of unprecedented situation that's going on in Washington right now of, you know, significant layoffs, the wonky funding. I don't even know if they're technically funding cuts because Congress didn't approve them, but are you seeing different things happening at FDA? Are they even reviewing anything? Is there any recourse if they don't? All that sort of thing. It's a good question.
Yeah, it's been quite the crazy road the last few years. It's been a back and forth. So we did a lot of advocacy around the cuts. I fear we lost some good people at NIH and at FDA. However, I was lucky to be a part of a meeting with the current acting commissioner at FDA, who his first meeting, he wanted to see a group of rare disease leaders. So I was amongst 15 people who were able to make a statement about how at FDA. What I see now at FDA is them trying to provide more stability. I think some investors got skittish when they saw what was happening with that sort of first iteration of leadership. I predict it'll come back. They're trying to get back some of the good people at FDA who have institutional knowledge. We're also trying to legislate that the FDA do more around knowledge management, meaning that how they've reviewed rare disease drugs in the past and used flexibility, we want that knowledge shared across any reviewer that comes in, right? Limitations with our natural history, the use of new outcome measures, et cetera. So it isn't a catastrophe, but it certainly was a chilling in terms of the funding. We know labs that shut down. I think we took a bit of a step back, but my hope is that, you know, we'll gain ground again.
Anybody else have any questions? Yeah, and I think, Ryan, when I first connected with him after the Combined Brain Conference, I was like, I want to do a PFDD. How do we do it tomorrow? He's like, hold on. But I mean, that's the kind of urgency we want to work with, right? And I think it's great to have urgency, but you want to make sure that you're also calculated and strategic about that. And so Ryan has proven to be kind of just this mentor to be able to help guide us forward. And even what he just mentioned now is that he's offered to conduct webinars with our community. And it's something as an organization that when we went to Combined Brain and we just think about advocacy in where we might have blind spots, that's one of them. And that's going to take the community stepping forward and helping push the initiatives forward. So we'll offer some webinars with Ryan for sure, but I think the big headline is how important your voice matters in all of this. And really, when we're looking at treatments, we're having those conversations, what's going to be meaningful? And we touched on seizures, we touched on regression, we'll touch on sleep. Language being able to communicate, whatever that looks like, those are all critical things that we want to identify, and your voice is going to be critical in helping us formulate what that ultimately that package looks like to the FDA. So thank you, Ryan.